Welcome students, welcome to this presentation on partial equilibrium effects of tariff. Let's look at what are the tools of protection. Essentially, there are two kinds of tools here. One is called the tariff and the other is known as the non-tariff barriers. This presentation is about tariff as a barrier. What is a tariff? Tariff is a duty imposed on goods that arrive into the domestic economy from foreign economies. It is a kind of a indirect tax. Tariffs have been very commonly used by almost all countries of the world. Countries like the USA had used tariff for a very long time to protect its manufacturing industry, and it was given up only after the 1920s. The World War, the Great Depression also saw the retaliatory tariffs being imposed. That means one country imposes a tariff and another country would retaliate to that and pose a higher rate of tariff. So all these kind of restrictionist methods resulted in the collapse of the international trade and also the Great Depression and the kind of difficulties that this depression brought on to people. With the setting up of the GATT in 1947, countries worked towards reducing the tariffs and making the movement towards more free trade. With the setting up of the WTO, finally the purpose of the one of the main purpose of WTO is to ensure more free trade and also reduce the tariff as much as possible, with member countries negotiating with each other and reducing the rates of tariff. So this is the way forward towards creating more free trade, because we know what are the advantages of free trade and the disadvantages of following undue amounts of protection. Looking at India's trade history, we know that India had followed protection before independence, and after independence, India took to planning, and this planning had the goal to become self-reliant economy. And in this process of becoming self-reliant economy, India had to establish a large number of key and basic industries which India did not have. Now, these infant industries at that time could not have faced the competition of the international market, and therefore India had followed tariff as a tool of protection. The problem with India was that it had charged, in some cases, as high as 80% tariff. India became very uncompetitive in the international trade world and got into international crisis by the end of 1980s. So the tariff rates were reduced. That was the task, reducing their tariff rate. And from then on, the tariff rates have been constantly being reduced. However, in 2017, the government has resorted to imposing a series of tariffs again on electronics and non-essential. Now, we are looking at the effect of tariffs on the economy. There are two ways to look at the effect of tariffs on the economy. One is using the partial equilibrium analysis, and the other is using the general equilibrium analysis. This presentation is on partial equilibrium analysis. Partial equilibrium analysis, we know, has got several assumptions to make, and these are the assumptions. So we are talking about perfectly competitive markets in both the countries that we take. Then we are talking about goods as perfect substitutes and goods are homogeneous nature. Understanding the demand side, we say that the consumer's taste, preferences and income remains the same. Looking at the supply side, we believe that the cost conditions don't change, so there are no technological changes that can take place. And to make analysis easier, we assume that there is no transport cost and there is free trade among nations. Now, let's take this first example where we talk about a domestic economy which does not have any trade with outside world. So how does the market mechanism work? It's a simple market mechanism. The demand curve DD sloping downwards and the supply curve sloping upwards. The equilibrium point at E and price at OP and quantity at Q. I just put those dots there and the lines there because these two concepts we will be using later too. The concept of producer surplus and consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is DEP and producer surplus is PES. Please remember this because you will need this concept later when we are doing redistributive effects. So first one is without trade. Now second stage is let's introduce trade. So when we introduce trade, it means that the foreign country can supply its good into the country far more competitive at a far more competitive price than what is available in the domestic economy. There is free trade, there is no tariff as yet. So the world supply curve is a perfectly elastic supply curve. WPWS is a perfectly elastic supply curve. That means any amount can be sold at that price in this country. So with this supply price, green supply line that has come in, we can see two responses. So one is from the producer side and the other is from the consumer side. What should happen to the consumer? Consumer definitely finds that the WP or the world price at which the commodity is being sold in the market is much lower than the price which was in the domestic economy. Domestic economy price was OP and the world the price is WS. At this stage, what is done is the consumers operating with the law of demand will demand more of the commodity at OQ2. So consumers will demand more from OQ to OQ2 at a lower price OWP. Now, the producers would just behave the opposite. What happens to the producers? Now, producers are not able to compete in the market at such a low price and therefore are forced to reduce their production. So, their production, instead of being at OQ, moves towards the left at OQ1. The price is much lower than the domestic price at WP, which is not possible, it is not competitive for the local producers to produce. So they produce less, they move from E to A or they move from OQ to OQ1. The next result that you can observe is since the domestic producers have reduced their production and consumers have increased their demand, there is a shortage of goods in the economy, Q1, Q2. This is simple microeconomics. Either there is a shortage of the goods Q1, Q2 in the economy, or we can say there is excess demand in the economy of Q1, Q2. So this, how do we meet this Q1, Q2 excess demand or shortage? This Q1, Q2, the blue arrow, indicates that this amount will be purchased from outside or they will be imported into the country. So this diagram is for the domestic economy, which has allowed free trade to happen but not yet imposed a tariff. So the third stage, first stage is domestic economy, second stage is we have opened up the economy and it is under free trade but without tariff. Third stage we will see the same economy when there is a tariff introduced, what will happen to the consumers and to the producers. Impact of tariff. Kindleberger has analyzed the effect of tariff on the economy on 8 subheadings, and we shall examine these 8 subheadings in the presentation. The first, you can see what happens to the price when the third stage, when the government imposes a tariff. The government may now feel that the domestic producers are losing out and the imported goods are being sold at a lower price than the domestic producers, and the government may decide to impose a tariff on the commodity that is being imported. So when the government imposes a tariff on the good that is being imported, that amount in this diagram is PT, the red line. Now PT, the arrow showing up, is the quantity of tax that has been imposed on the imported commodity. In such case, the price will rise by the full amount of WPPT. So the WP price, which was the free trade price, has now moved up to the red line, which is the PT price. Now this PT price is the one that will rule the domestic economy now with these imported goods, and we have to now analyze what will happen to different what will be the different effects of this imposition of tariff in the economy. The incidence of tariff will fall on the consumers and on the producers. The first one is called the productive effect, also known as the protective effect, also known as the import substitution effect. Now follow the diagram. Um, it's like this. The imported price of goods will rise. By how much? It will rise by the tariff. How much is the tariff? PT is the WP, PT is the tariff. So that upward arrow shows that the tariff has been imposed of WP, PT. Now, when the domestic price, the price at which this imported goods will be sold in the economy is better than or higher than the price WP. So, what will be the response of the producers? Obviously, the producers will find an incentive to produce more because they can sell it at a higher price than what it was when there was free trade in the economy. So, the domestic producers will now increase their production from OQ1 to OQ4. They will move towards the right. So you can see the arrow, they have moved from OQ1 to OQ4. Not only have they increased the production, they can now sell it at a higher price of OPT. Earlier they had to sell it at OWP, which was very low, very uncompetitive for them, not competitive for them. Now they can increase the price and sell it at OPT because the tariff has made the domestic price better. So producers will now enjoy a certain amount of increased surplus. So the producer surplus earlier we found had reduced to WPAS. That was a very small triangle that was available for the producers because they had lost out in terms of production. Supply had reduced. Now with the increase in supply, the producer surplus also increases from WPAS to SPTG. So the triangle PTGS is the producer surplus after the imposition of the tariff. Now, why do we call it productive? There is a production change that has happened because the domestic producer has increased its production. It is also known as protective effect because the producers have been protected against the importing goods, and also known as substitution effect because what was being imported from other country, a part of that imported good is actually substituted by the domestic production that is now available in the market. So this is the first important effect of the imposition of a tariff. The second, now once the producer's side is known, we also need to understand what happens to the consumer when this tariff is imposed. Now we know that the consumers are operating with the operation on the law of demand and the changes in the price. Now with the imposition of a tariff, the price of the commodity has increased by the full amount of the tariff. So when the price has increased from OWP to OPT, the consumers will respond to it in a different way. What would they do now? They will reduce their consumption. The producers increase their production, consumers will reduce their production. How much has it reduced? It has reduced. The consumer will reduce the consumption by the blue arrow on the horizontal axis from Q2 to Q3. There is a fall in the consumers' demand for commodity because the prices of commodity is now at OPT and consumer will buy less of it. So when the consumers buy less of it, we find that the consumer also undergoes a loss of consumer surplus, and this consumer surplus loss from, instead of DBWP, when on the green line the consumer surplus was DBWP, and because of the because of the imposition of the tariff, the consumer surplus has now reduced from DBWP to DFPT. So the red line. So there is only that much, there is a loss of consumer surplus of the amount PTFBWP. So the gap between the red line and the green line is a loss for the consumers in terms of consumers surplus. And yet we say that the consumers have part of their consumption is taken from the imported goods, but the other part of what their demands are met by the domestic production that has taken place. The third effect is known as the revenue effect. Now remember that the purposes of imposing tariffs are many, and one of them is to obtain revenue for the government. So in this particular case, now we can see how much does the government gain as revenue because of the imposition of a tariff. The tariff is on per unit of the commodity. It could be ad valorem or it could be specific. They are the two different kinds that you can see. There are many different varieties of tariffs, but I'm just using the ad valorem or specific. Now let me take specifically the specific tax. That means on every unit of commodity, if there is a 100 rupees tax on it, then that is the tax on per unit of that commodity. Now that 100 rupees tax on every single unit multiplied by the number of units. So if there is 100 into 100 rupees per unit that is taxed, then let us say that 5 units are imported. So 100 into 5 is the total revenue that the government will get. That is what is shown in the diagram. So the revenue will be, the total revenue that will be collected by the government will be PTWP is the tariff, and the quantity that is going to be imported now is Q4Q3. So Q4Q3 multiplied by PT will give us GFJH. So that rectangle is the one that will show us the amount of revenue that the government gets by the imposition of tariff on the imported commodity. There are also the welfare or redistributive effect. Partly I have explained it earlier, but to explain it again, it means that because of this imposition of tariff, the welfare effects are also altered, or there is a redistribution of welfare from the consumer to the producer that can happen because of the imposition of tariff. So consumer surplus, as I have told you, will reduce when there is an imposition of tariff. So consumer surplus reduces from um, um, DB from DBWP to DFPT. So from the green line and the triangle that is coming down, it has reduced now to the red line, and therefore the consumer surplus is much lesser now at DFPT. Now, of this consumers who have lost their welfare, part of that welfare they have lost to the government in the form of revenue. So the out of this total surplus, that consumer surplus that the consumer would have got, which was DBWP, a part of that, the red square area, GFHJ, has already gone to the government. So that's a loss for the consumer. Then there is also a loss for the economy in terms of inefficiency, because the producer is now producing more. He's producing from OQ to OQ1. Now he's forced to produce that because the incentive is there to sell it at a higher price. But we have to assume that that portion is inefficient production is taking place, and the GAH is the inefficient allocation of resources. So unnecessarily we are producing goods in the economy at an inefficient quality. Then we also have another loss that the economy will make, where it is called a dead weight. The consumer surplus is lost and we lose out FJB. This FJB we will never be able to recover. The consumers have lost it because they're not going to operate at that position at all. So that is called as dead weight of the economy. So we have GHA, which is associated with inefficient production, FJB, which is associated with the dead weight, and GFJH is the revenue that has gone to the government. So that is the total loss that the consumer has to bear a loss of PTG AWP. So the total red line between the red line and the green line is a total loss for the consumer. The next one, we can see the other effects. This can be explained even without the table. Now, there are a lot of controversies that are associated with these effects. One is that of competitive effect, which says that because of the imposition of a tariff, we protect the domestic industries from foreign competition, and domestic industries can become inefficient, and they may produce poor quality goods. And it also argument is that it can strengthen the monopolies that already exist in the economy, or it can even create the emergence of monopoly. So once competition is prevented, free market mechanism is prevented, then this results in the formation of inefficient production and also eliminates foreign competition. The other one is terms of trade. Now, with the tax that has been imposed, the country, it may help the country to improve the terms of trade, and that means the amount of goods that it will receive in exchange of its goods may be higher now. So they say that it can increase the terms of trade of the country. And foreign suppliers may also be forced to reduce their price if they want to sell it in the country, in which case we may be able to get more than what we are offering them as goods. The other one is that balance of payment, because we may have a favorable balance of payment, one reason. Second reason is because we are restricting the import of unnecessary goods or the goods with high tariff, we may be able to correct the balance of payment disequilibrium and increase the situation of balance of payment. Then the another argument, but however this is not argued well, because the economists who don't agree to this say that if the economy is going to correct this balance of payment by not importing goods from the other country, the other countries too can respond to us the same way and restrict imports from our country. There's another likely, there are other argument is, let the country produce more goods, make it cheaper, and sell it to the world market. That is how economies grow, not by restricting trade. As I told you in the last presentation, that this debate between protection and free trade continues, and this is seen even in these kind of arguments that are put in for restricting the trade into the country. The income and employment effects are understood in terms of the when we restrict the imports from other countries, the domestic economies are forced to produce more, and because it is forced to produce more, it will have more employment, it will have more multiplier, it will also, the accelerator will also operate, and then we can have the multiplier accelerator operating, and the economy should grow in terms of increasing in income and employment. However, there are many critics who do not agree to this as well. Nevertheless, these are issues of, these are the partial analysis, but how it actually happens in a country depends upon the kinds of goods that it has posed its restrictions on, and the retaliatory behavior of the other country, and how the countries have moved together by finding mutual agreement of the tariffs that they want to restrict. So, and that is how we understand the partial equilibrium analysis or the effects of tariff in the economy. Thank you very much. I hope you have subscribed to this channel. And if you haven't, please do subscribe to this channel. Thank you very much.